a broken cry from an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere. But what he found inside, bruised bound and whispering for him, would unravel everything he thought he believed in. What could make a man of God question the very altar he served? And what kind of truth leaves scars deeper than any wound? Would you turn away, or stay and face what others buried? Our tale begins on a sweltering afternoon in 1873, when preacher Samuel Everett's footsteps crossed a threshold he was never meant to find. The sun hung heavy like a coin forged from fire, hovering low in the Texas sky, casting long trembling shadows over the cracked earth. The land didn't breathe anymore. It just endured year after year, like the old folks who outlived everyone they loved. Samuel Everett walked slowly down the dirt trail that led away from the church, not toward it. His black coat clung to his back like a burden he couldn't shrug off. The Bible under his arm felt heavier than it used to, as if the truth inside it had grown tired of being believed. He hadn't preached last Sunday, or the Sunday before that. No one asked why. People knew how to look the other way when a man's spirit starts to sink quietly like a house in sand. The dust curled around his boots, whispering old psalms he couldn't recall anymore. His face, once smooth and boyish when he came to this town a decade ago, was now a map of disappointment. His mother used to say, "The Lord gives us calluses to keep from feeling everything too deeply." But lately, Samuel felt too much or nothing at all. He didn't know why he turned down the old fence line that day, only that something in him did. A drift, a pull, like grief with no name. The barn came into view like a ghost rising from heat waves. It had been empty for years, its wooden ribs exposed like a carcass, sun-bleached and long forgotten. Most folks said it was haunted, but Samuel didn't believe in ghosts. Not anymore. People didn't come back. Not really. He stepped closer. That's when he heard it. Not a sound meant for anyone else. Just a thread of a noise stretched thin and desperate, a moan barely human. A woman's moan, frayed at the edges. He froze. There was a time when he would have run. A time when he'd have thought the Lord sent me here. But that time had passed. All that was left was a man and the weight he carried. His fingers closed tighter around the worn brass handle of the barn door. He pushed it open. The smell hit first old straw, rusted nails, blood. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. She lay half buried in the hay ropes cutting into her wrists and ankles, a pale blue dress torn and soaked in dark spreading red. Abigail Monroe. A name he hadn't spoken in years, not since she left town, and everyone forgot to ask why. Her eyes fluttered open. There was a flicker of something there, not fear. Worse, recognition. He knelt beside her, and his voice came out rough, as if it had been buried with her. "Abigail, it's Samuel. Do you remember me?" Her lips trembled. "Please, don't lift my skirt." He flinched, almost like she'd struck him. The words felt like barbed wire wrapped around his ribs. "I need to stop the bleeding," he whispered. She nodded once, barely. With a shaking hand, he raised the hem of her dress. What he saw undid him. A message carved into her thigh, ragged and wet and unforgiving. She saw too much. It wasn't just blood. It was cruelty. Intentional. Personal. A silence cracked open inside Samuel Everett. Not the holy kind. The kind that swallows you whole. He'd buried folks, held mothers while they wept over sons, listened to confessions from behind closed doors. But nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as this moment. Abigail looked at him, her voice barely above the creak of the rafters. Wade Blackwell did this. Him and his dogs. Samuel's breath hitched. Wade Blackwell, the banker who paid for the church roof. The man who fed the town and bled it at the same time. The man Samuel had blessed in front of a crowd 3 Sundays past. Abigail closed her eyes, a tear slipping into the hay. "I was just trying to bring the old man his mail," she whispered. "Mr. Whitmore. I found land deeds, real ones. Wade forged them, took everything. Said he killed the old man himself and made it look like rope work. Said, I saw too much." The barn seemed to hold its breath. Samuel looked at the girl he'd once seen sing in choir, now a canvas of brutality. She opened her eyes again. "They said no one would believe me, that even you wouldn't." Samuel didn't answer right away. His hand hovered over her wound, helpless. Then he said it almost like a confession. "They were right, until now." Abigail gave a faint, bitter smile. "I used to think the world had rules, that if you told the truth, someone would protect you." Her voice caught like wind in a broken shutter. "But the truth is, the ones who lie sleep better." Samuel stood his shadow, cast long and thin across the barn floor. "I'm not the man I used to be," he said quietly. "Good," she rasped. "The man you used to be would have prayed for me and left." That hit harder than he expected. He bent down again, gently untied her wrists. "I won't leave you, Abigail. Not now. Not after what they did." She didn't thank him. She just nodded. "Sometimes that's more sacred." He lifted her slowly, reverently, like holding the last page of a ruined book. She was light as a hymn, and just as full of sorrow. Outside, the wind picked up. The land groaned beneath his boots as he carried her step by step back toward the church he no longer served, and the cabin he'd once kept for silence. A coyote howled in the far distance. Samuel didn't flinch. For the first time in a long time, he was awake, and the man he was becoming didn't believe in leaving people behind. The barn was still breathing dust. Samuel Everett stood frozen just inside the door, the air thick with the scent of old hay sweat and something metallic that clung to the back of his throat. The silence after her whisper, "Please don't lift my skirt," was heavier than the 100 sermons he'd once delivered. But none of those words could stop blood, and she was bleeding. Bad. Her skirt was soaked at the thigh, a dark bloom of crimson that pulsed outward like it had its own heartbeat. The color of endings. "Ma'am," he said, gently kneeling, "I'm not here to harm you. But if I don't stop that bleeding—" She didn't respond. Her eyes, wide, glassy, and terrified, held his for a moment, then fluttered shut. He could see her body trembling, whether from shock or pain or something deeper he couldn't say. Only that time was running out, and faith, whatever was left of it, was no match for what he saw. He reached for the hem of her tattered skirt with hands that had once turned pages of scripture. They shook now, not from lust or shame, but from the fear of what he might find. And then he saw it. Carved into her flesh, just above her right thigh, raw and red and wicked. She saw too much. The words weren't scratched. They were cut. Deep. Deliberate. Meant to stay. Samuel's breath caught. His stomach turned in on itself. He'd seen cruelty before on the battlefield in confessions whispered through tears, but this was different. This wasn't punishment. This was branding. This was a message as clear and cold as any gospel. She saw too much. That wasn't just about her. It was a warning. He carried her out of the barn in his arms, boots crunching over dry earth, the sun a silent witness overhead. She weighed less than she should have. Her body was limp, but her fingers twitched now and then, curling as if grasping for something long gone. His cabin sat 1.5 miles east of the chapel. A squat thing built of pine and prayers, though both were rotting now. He laid her on the bed that used to be his mother's. The sheets were worn, but clean. He whispered a prayer over her, not to God, but to the woman herself, as if some part of her might hear. Then he got to work. By lantern light, he washed the wound with trembling care, gritting his teeth every time she winced. She didn't scream, didn't speak, only breathed through her nose like someone who'd learned that sound meant pain. He boiled water, crushed herbs, bound her thighs with soft strips of flannel. Her blood stopped pulsing after a while, but the message in her skin glared back at him like fire on stone. He didn't sleep that night. He sat beside her watching the rise and fall of her chest, the way her hands curled into her chest like a child's. At one point, she whimpered in her sleep, a long dragging sound, like a sob that couldn't escape. He reached out, then stopped, afraid touch might shatter her again. By morning, his back ached from the wooden chair. He lit the stove, cooked broth. She didn't wake until noon. Her eyes blinked open slowly, still dull, still wary. He moved quietly, spoon in hand. "You're safe," he said. That was a lie, but a necessary one. She didn't speak. "Name's Samuel," he added. "You're at my place. No one knows you're here but me." Her lips cracked when she tried to wet them. He dipped a rag in water and touched them gently. "Abigail," she whispered. He leaned closer. "What was that?" "Abigail," she repeated a little stronger. Then after a pause, "Monroe." He nodded, though he already knew. Her face had been in his mind since he found her. Not because of beauty, though, even battered she had it. No, because she was the first thing in years that had made him feel again. "Abigail," he said softly. "That's a good name." She turned her face to the wall. It wasn't until the second evening, after he'd redressed her wound and helped her sip broth again, that she finally spoke. "I didn't tell anyone," she said. He looked up from the chair. "Tell who what?" "They think I did. I didn't." Her voice was a rasp, low and broken. "I didn't tell anyone about the deeds, about what Wade did to Mr. Whitmore. I saw them. I heard them talk about making it look like a suicide." Samuel didn't move. "They laughed," she added, "when they dragged him out of the house. I heard it. His son thought it was the bottle, but I saw the ledger, the real one. Wade took the land, killed for it, and then they came for me." Her hands trembled now, fingers twitching under the blanket. "Said they'd make sure I never spoke again." "They tried," Samuel said quietly. She looked at him, then really looked, and for a moment the flicker of something else passed between them. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the ghost of it. "You believe in God?" she asked suddenly. Samuel hesitated. "Then I used to. Why'd you stop?" He glanced toward the stove, the kettle just starting to hiss. "Because I saw too much," he said. Abigail closed her eyes. A faint breath, almost a laugh, escaped her lips. "Then I guess we match." That night, she slept without crying out. Samuel sat beside her again, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't pray, not to the God of pulpits or psalms, but in his heart he made a vow not to let her story end in silence, not to let those words she saw too much be the last thing the world ever said about Abigail Monroe. The wind shifted that morning. It didn't howl, it didn't moan. It just moved soft, deliberate, like it knew something no one else did. Inside the modest cabin tucked into a bend of dry cottonwoods, Samuel Everett knelt by the hearth, stirring a tin pot of boiled herbs and yarrow poultice. His hands were steady, but his chest held a storm. He hadn't prayed, not in days, but something in the way the wind paused outside listening made him feel like maybe the silence had been listening back. Behind him, Abigail stirred. She didn't speak right away, just shifted in the cot. The blanket slid down her shoulder. Faint scars like faded ink marked her skin, old and cruel. Samuel didn't turn. "Is it morning?" she asked, her voice dry and hollowed out. "Somewhere," he replied softly, not quite sure what place he meant. He poured hot water into a chipped mug and carried it over. She sat up, slowly wincing as her body remembered everything it had endured. Her fingers curled around the tin mug, as if it might offer more than warmth. There was a long pause. Then her eyes found his. "I want to tell you something," she said. Samuel set the jar of salve down on the windowsill. He didn't ask what. He just nodded. Abigail's breath caught, and for a moment she looked like she might turn away. Her hands tightened on the mug. Then, steady but trembling, she spoke. "His name is Wade Blackwell." The name dropped between them like a stone into a quiet pond. The air stilled. Samuel's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. "He owns the land office now." Abigail continued, her voice low, flat, like a confession. "The bank. The sheriff, too, probably. Maybe even the preacher in town. Though I suppose you'd know if that were true." She meant it without malice, but the words still left a bruise. Samuel sat down across from her, his hands folded in his lap. He waited. "He killed Mr. Whitmore, made it look like suicide. The man had arthritis so bad he couldn't even cock a pistol. But they found one in his hand." Her lips twisted, clean shiny, as if he'd just bought it. "He was my friend," Samuel said quietly. Abigail's eyes flickered. "Then you understand." She took another sip from the mug. Her hands didn't shake anymore. "I worked for the clerk's office," she said. "Not official, just helped sort papers. Wade would come in sometimes, always smiling, always pressing too close, called me sunshine in a box of bones." Her eyes narrowed bitter, said it like a compliment. Samuel's jaw clenched, but he kept still. "I saw what he was doing, switching deeds, forging names, selling land that wasn't his. Mostly old folks' people who wouldn't know better until it was gone. Then one day, I stayed late, found a ledger that didn't match the others. I took it home." She looked down at her cup. "I was going to bring it to Whitmore, but they got there first." The room felt colder now, though the fire hadn't gone out. "They dragged me out to that barn, made me watch them burn the pages. Then they beat me for every line I'd read. She didn't cry, not once. They branded me with his initial. Right here." She pulled the collar of her blouse just enough to reveal the corner of a red, twisted mark. "Wade said if anyone ever saw it, they'd know I belonged to him. Like cattle." Her voice broke a little then. "I don't think I belong to anybody anymore." Silence. Then Samuel reached forward and gently covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm rough from years of holding Bibles, then rifles. He didn't say "you don't," or "you're free now," or any of the other words that might cheapen the moment. He just said, "You're here." And somehow, that was enough. Later that evening, the light slanted gold through the windows, painting long shadows across the wooden floor. Abigail sat in the rocking chair, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Samuel stood at the window, watching the wind toy with the tall grass. Neither spoke for a while. Then she asked almost softly, "Do you think God was watching?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of the glass, then turned slow and tired. "I think," he said, voice hoarse, "if he was." He turned away. Abigail's mouth trembled, not from fear, but something older, deeper. Or maybe she whispered, "He was waiting to see what we would do." Samuel blinked. That stopped him. Not like a slap, more like the sudden realization that maybe she was right. That night, after the fire burned down low, Abigail reached under the cot and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle she'd hidden since the first night. Inside, a small torn corner of the original ledger, singed at the edges, barely readable. But one name was still there. Wade Blackwell, filed transfer of property. C. Whitmore, W. Blackwell. No signature. Samuel took it in both hands like it was holy scripture. "They didn't find it on me," she said. "They thought the fire ate it all. but I tucked it under the floorboard when they untied me to make me run. For sport, I think." Samuel looked at her then. Truly looked. Not as a victim. Not even as a survivor. But as someone braver than any man he'd known in the pulpit. He placed the paper gently on the table, then turned to the cupboard, pulling out a small leather-bound notebook. "I'll keep it here," he said, "until the right time." Abigail nodded once. "Just don't keep it too long." Her voice held no bitterness, only resolve. As the moon climbed, Samuel stepped outside, hands in his coat pockets. The stars above the plains burned like watchful eyes. He used to look up there and think, heaven. Now he looked across the field toward the barn where he found her and thought, hell. But inside that cabin, wrapped in blankets, slept a woman who had faced both and still dared to speak. And he who once feared doubt more than death had chosen to stay. He didn't whisper a prayer that night, but for the first time in years, he listened. And for once the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting for truth, for justice, for a reckoning that would begin with a woman who refused to stay buried, and the man who finally chose to rise with her. The night wrapped around the cabin like a worn quilt, threadbare, patched with silence and smoke. Outside, the wind scraped against the walls like something old and unsettled. Inside, the world had narrowed to the slow boil of a tin kettle, the creak of aging floorboards, and the fractured rhythm of a woman's breath. Abigail Monroe lay on the cot near the fireplace, swaddled in wool blankets that smelled faintly of pine and tobacco. Her body was still healing inch by inch from wounds that had long since bled dry. But it was her eyes, gray-hollowed and too still, that spoke of the real breakage. Across the room, Samuel Everett crouched by the hearth, feeding the fire with pieces of seasoned mesquite. He didn't look at her, not directly. Men like him once made of sermons, and second chances knew when presence meant more than words. The flames caught in his tired eyes, blue turned brittle with the weight of what he'd seen. "Do you ever feel like the fire knows things?" Abigail asked, her voice sandpapered and low, "like it watches you when you're too tired to lie anymore?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He watched the wood catch flame, curl into ember. Then he spoke, voice quiet as the settling ash. "I think it remembers," he said. "Not what you did, just that you were there, and that you stayed." She let that settle. Outside, a wolf cried far off, its howl low and drawn out, like it had lost something it couldn't name. Samuel cleaned her wounds each morning with hands that no longer shook. He had become methodical gauze salve wrap. But it was the pause between steps, the silent way he knelt beside her, that carried meaning. Abigail never flinched anymore. Her body still bore the branded M of Mason Graves, like a curse seared into flesh, but her gaze was steadier now. He didn't ask her about it. He didn't have to. One night, after changing her bandages, she whispered, "He said I was a letter no one should read. So he tore the pages out of me." Samuel closed his eyes. "And yet, here you are," he murmured. They shared little talk in the daylight. But at night, when firelight softened the hard edges of memory, Abigail spoke in fragments, and Samuel listened. "Do you remember what a church smells like after rain?" she asked once. He nodded, "Like old books and forgiveness." She smiled faintly. "And lemon oil on the pews. My mama used to clean them humming hymns. She'd tell me, 'Don't ever kneel without knowing what you're kneeling for.'" I didn't understand it then. "Do you now?" he asked. "I think so. Some things don't deserve prayer." There were nights when she would wake screaming, not loud, but raw, like the sound had to squeeze past old bruises in her lungs. Samuel never spoke when it happened. He'd just sit up in the chair beside her bed place, a calloused hand gently on her arm, until she came back to the room. "Did I bleed through again?" she asked one morning. Voice hoarse. No, he said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. It was just the dark trying to lie to you. The town below still whispered Mason Graves's name like it was carved in the church bell. Untouchable, unbreakable. But they didn't know the weight of his sins, not like Abigail did. Not like Samuel now did. Graves had once visited Samuel's church with silver cufflinks and a hollow smile. You preach real pretty, Everett, he'd said after one sermon. But you talk like truth is free. In this town everything's got a price, including silence. Samuel never forgot that. He remembered the way Graves looked at women, like property, like risk. God watches us all, Samuel had told him then. Graves had laughed. Good. Tell him I'm watching back. Now, each day that Abigail healed Samuel, felt something else healing too slow and unsteady, like spring thaw in a place that hadn't known water in years. But it wasn't faith he was returning to. It wasn't the God of pulpits and linen vestments. It was something quieter. He watched her one morning as she peeled an apple with stiff fingers. The knife trembled slightly, but she kept going, curling the red skin into a single ribbon. I don't want to be made of pain anymore, she said, eyes fixed on the blade. I want to be ordinary again. I want to burn bread and leave laundry out too long. I want someone to roll their eyes when I forget the milk. You deserve more than ordinary, he said. No, she said, lifting her eyes to his. Ordinary is heaven. That night she asked him why he had stayed. You could have walked away, and no one would have blamed you, not even me. He looked into the fire. It had burned low coals glowing like heartbeats under ash. Because the worst kind of cowardice is the kind that dresses up as peace, he said. And because when I lifted your skirt, I saw what evil really looks like, and I couldn't preach another word until I did something about it. She nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. Thank you for not being like them. I'm not better, he said. I'm just ashamed enough to try. They never spoke of love, not directly, but it filled the spaces between wood creaks and fire snaps. It breathed in the silence. Not desire, not romance, not yet. Something older, something earned. And on one cold night when the fire was low and her strength had returned enough for her to sit beside him, she reached out and placed her hand over his. Would you stay? She asked if the scars never faded. He turned to her eyes, wet but steady. Would you leave? He asked if mine never did either. Their hands stayed there quiet and still as the fire settled into soft glowing coals. The morning had a stillness to it, one that didn't belong to peace, but to the kind of hush that comes just before the first drop of blood hits the dirt. Inside the weathered cabin, Samuel Everett sat at the small pine table, watching the fire whisper against the iron kettle. His hands were clasped not in prayer, but in something older, something heavier. Memory, perhaps, or reckoning. Behind him, Abigail stirred beneath the woolen quilt. She had begun sleeping deeper, her breath more, even now. But the nights still took their toll. Her shoulders curled inward, like she expected pain to come even in her rest. The scars on her legs were healing, though Samuel hadn't dared lift the bandages in 3 days. Not out of neglect, but out of reverence. Some wounds don't want light. They want silence and time, and someone who stays. He reached for his rifle without needing to think. Just the way a man reaches for coffee, or for the edge of the table he's always known. That's when he heard it. The whistle of wind, only it wasn't wind. It was too measured, too human. 3 horses, coming fast. They didn't try to hide their approach. Dust swirled in angry coils behind them. The first rider, Billy Crane, was easy to spot. He wore that same fool grin, like he'd just kicked over a church pew and dared someone to stop him. Next to him rode Cole Ramsey, face sharp and hollow, like a knife that had cut too many times to care any more. And the third. Samuel's gut tightened. The third man wore a deputy's badge, one Wade Blackwell had appointed himself right after the sheriff went missing last winter. They came to a halt just beyond the cabin, boots slamming the dirt. Billy shouted his voice a whip through the stillness. "Reckon you found something that don't belong to you, Reverend. Why don't you be a man and send her out?" Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and met their eyes. "She's not a possession," he said. "She's a person. Something you boys gave up on being long ago." Billy laughed, dismounting with a jangle of spurs. "Look at you, all righteous now. But we remember, don't we? The man who used to preach peace while sipping whiskey behind closed doors. You got a past preacher, and it ain't holy." Samuel didn't flinch. He knew his past well. It curled up beside him every night. "If I've sinned," he said, "I'll answer for it. But I won't answer to you." Inside the cabin, Abigail had already risen. She stood just behind the door, knife in hand, lips pressed thin. She wasn't trembling. She had heard Billy's voice before in the dark in her dreams. She remembered the way he laughed when Reese carved the words into her skin. She saw too much. But now she remembered something else, too. Samuel's voice, quiet and trembling, when he first carried her through the brush. "I've got you," he'd said. Not like a hero, more like a confession. Cole Ramsey stepped forward, voice slick, like oil on creek water. "You think this is about revenge?" he asked. "You're not that interesting, Reverend. This is business. Miss Monroe saw things, signed papers. You should know Blackwell's got men in the courthouse, men in the bank, even men in church. We don't need to kill you. But we will." Samuel's gaze didn't leave Cole's. "Then do what you came to do," he said. "But you'll bleed for every inch you try to take." For a moment, no one moved. Even the birds had gone quiet. Then Billy spat in the dirt. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's see how much she's worth to you." He raised his pistol, but before he could aim, a shot rang out from the cabin window. A clean, sharp echo. Billy dropped his gun and screamed, blood blooming from his shoulder. Abigail stepped out, both hands steady. "The next one goes between your eyes," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You remember me now, don't you?" Cole grabbed Billy and dragged him back behind a boulder. The third man, deputy or not, fled on horseback without firing a shot. They were cowards, but not fools, and Abigail had made sure of that. Silence settled once more, broken only by Billy's distant curses. Samuel lowered his rifle. He turned to Abigail. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. She looked at him, her hair tangled, cheeks, flushed hands still gripping the barrel. "They were coming for you," she answered. "They always come for the quiet ones first. I won't let that happen again." Samuel opened his mouth, then closed it. There was a long silence. Not awkward, just heavy. He walked to her, slow, as if approaching a doe wounded but still proud. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You saved us both." She looked down at his hand. "You already saved me," she said. "The night you stayed." That night they sat by the fire. Abigail stitched new fabric over the bullet hole in the curtain. Samuel watched her hands, small, rough, determined. He reached for the Bible on the shelf, then let it fall back. Not in dismissal, but in understanding. "I used to believe justice came from above," he said. "Now I think it comes from the ones who choose to stay when it's easier to walk away." Abigail didn't reply, but her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "Do you think it ends here?" she finally asked. Blackwell Samuel shook his head. "No, but he knows now. We're not afraid anymore." And that, she said, leaning back, is what they fear most. Later, as the wind rose and the fire dwindled, Abigail whispered a story from her childhood, about her mother braiding her hair by the river, about the way the water sounded like song, and how she believed back then that nothing bad could ever happen where wildflowers bloomed. Samuel listened not just with his ears, but with the kind of stillness that only comes from deep loss. "I don't remember her face," Abigail said, "but I remember the braid, the way it felt against my neck when I ran." Samuel didn't say anything. Instead, he reached for the strand of her hair nearest him, curled and soft like a memory half recalled. "We don't forget everything he said. Some things just hide until we're ready." She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes without flinching. And outside, somewhere beyond the trees, the wolves retreated. But not for long. They would return. And Samuel Everett knew it. But this time, they would not be welcomed by silence. They would meet truth. Wounded, but standing. Armed not with vengeance, but with the kind of love that refuses to look away. And for now, that was enough. The stillness was heavy, like the breath of the world had been caught in its own throat. Samuel Everett stood on the front porch, rifle in hand, back straight, not out of pride, but out of some deeper gravity, like a man who had finally accepted the weight he was born to carry. The wood beneath his boots creaked as the last light of afternoon stretched across the dry land in long amber fingers. Somewhere behind him, inside the small cabin, a kettle hissed quietly. Abigail was heating water. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had seen the dust before he did, rising like smoke on the far edge of the canyon trail. Now it was unmistakable, 3 riders coming fast. The sound came next, hooves pounding like war drums on the parched earth. They were still distant, but Samuel already knew. These weren't men arriving with questions. They were coming with answers. Final ones. He brought the rifle up, slow, deliberate, and leveled it against the horizon. The crosshairs trembled for only a second. Then they stilled. "You sure about this?" Abigail's voice came from behind the screen door, calm as creek water in spring. Samuel didn't look back. "I'm sure about you." A pause. Then the door opened with a soft creak, and she stepped beside him. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled, and in her right hand she held the knife he'd given her 3 nights ago, a hunting blade with a handle smooth from years of quiet use. "They won't talk first," she said. "They never do." Then the dust split. 3 silhouettes emerged, riders, hard and lean, outlines blurred by speed and the shimmering heat. The one in front wore a low-brimmed hat pulled tight over a mean face. Billy Crane, all twitch and temper. On his left was Cole Ramsey, slick and narrow-eyed, hands always close to his belt. The third, broader than the other 2, was a man Samuel didn't recognize, but he carried himself like someone who'd never had to explain his violence. Likely the kind Wade Blackwell kept for special tasks. The wind shifted, and with it, the voice of the Devil's Hound reached their porch. "Abigail Monroe." Billy Crane shouted, "You know what this is. Wade wants what's his. Come out, and we'll make it clean." Abigail's knuckles whitened on the knife handle. Her voice was low but clear. "I'm not his. I never was." Billy's laugh carried on the breeze like the rattle of a dying snake. "You think anyone cares about truth, girl? You think folks'll weep for some broken thing who couldn't keep her mouth shut?" Samuel didn't blink. "She's not the one who should be afraid." That was all the warning they got. Billy fired first, wild and hot. The bullet chewed into the porch rail inches from Samuel's thigh. Samuel's reply was not rushed. One breath, one pull of the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder in a dry canyon. Billy's body snapped back in the saddle, then crumpled sideways, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. No scream, just the sound of dust settling around him. The second rider, Cole Ramsey, wheeled his horse around the cabin, fast and silent, like a fox in high grass. Backside, Abigail hissed, already moving. She didn't wait for permission. She slipped into the shadows behind the porch, silent, as breath her bare feet barely disturbing the brittle ground. Samuel heard her disappear, and something in him quieted. Whatever happened now, she wasn't running. She was ready. Then came the sound of boots behind the cabin, followed by a sudden rustle and a gurgled breath that caught halfway and never finished. Silence. When Abigail reappeared from the side of the house, there was a fine line of red on her wrist, and her eyes were different. Not wild, not panicked, just calm, like someone who'd done what needed doing and could live with it. "He tried to talk," she said, almost a whisper. "Too late." Samuel nodded. "That's two." The third man was dismounting now. No more distance, no more bluffing. He came on foot, a brute of a figure with shoulders like fence posts and fists like river stones. His eyes locked on Samuel as he dropped the rifle. This was close work now. The man charged with a roar, pure muscle and rage, no finesse, no fear. Samuel stepped aside barely. The man's fist clipped his shoulder enough to spin him. He staggered, but didn't fall. The next blow came faster. Samuel ducked it, jammed his elbow into the man's ribs, heard the breath catch. But it wasn't enough. The brute came back with a knee to the gut, lifting Samuel off his feet, slamming him against the porch post. The wood splintered behind him, blood in his mouth, bones ringing like church bells. But something else stirred a memory, not of sermons, but of hands holding his father's shovel, of long summers digging graves no one visited. He'd buried too many things to stop now. The man swung again. Samuel caught his wrist, twisted. There was a sickening crack. The man screamed. Samuel didn't. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, grabbed the man's hair, yanked his head back, and with a sound that was not holy, but wholly human, slammed him face first into the porch rail until the wood snapped, until the man was still. And then nothing. Only breathing. Shallow. Both of them. Abigail walked over slowly. She didn't touch him, just stood beside him, watching the man's body slump to the ground. "Is it over?" she asked. Samuel wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "For now." A long pause. Then Abigail looked up at the horizon where the dust had come from. "I used to think, if I just stayed small, quiet, maybe life would leave me alone." She looked at her hands. "But monsters don't care if you whisper." Samuel sat down on the porch steps, exhaling slow. "No, they only stop when someone makes them." Another long silence. Then Abigail sat beside him, folding her arms around her knees, like a child watching the sunset. "You didn't have to stay," she said. Samuel looked at the blood on his knuckles, then at the horizon. "I know," he said. "That's why I did." And in the soft wind that moved across the plain, something shifted, not in the air, but in them. Not a victory, not peace, but something real. Hard-won, shared. For now, that was enough. The shovel made a dull, wet sound as it split the stubborn earth. Samuel Everett didn't look up. Not when the handle creaked, not when the blade struck stone, not even when the coppery scent of blood still clung to his sleeves like a second skin. He simply kept digging. Beside him, Abigail Monroe knelt over the third body. The night had gone long, too long. The bodies lay still under the fractured moonlight. Billy Crane with a chest wound that hadn't let him scream, Cole Ramsey with his throat carved open in one clean strike, and the last man. Samuel hadn't even asked his name before he crushed his windpipe and watched the light leave his eyes. He didn't feel victorious, only hollow. The preacher's hands, once used to holding Bibles and baptizing babies, now bore blisters from violence. There was no choir tonight, no psalms, only the rhythm of two souls burying the dead they never asked to kill. Abigail's face was streaked with dirt and sweat. Her blouse torn at the shoulder, stuck to her ribs where blood had dried in splotches. Yet her movements were precise, almost ritualistic. "Use the flat side," she murmured, handing him another spade. Less noise. He nodded. No words. Above them, the trees swayed in the windless night, as if God himself had turned away in shame. An hour passed. Maybe more. They worked in silence until 3 shallow graves waited under the cedar ridge behind the cabin. The scent of gunpowder had long since faded, replaced by damp soil and the sharp sting of fatigue. Abigail stood over Billy's body first. She didn't look at his face, what was left of it, but placed a rock beside his boot. "He laughed when they branded me," she said flatly. "He said it looked like a flower." Then she stepped back. Samuel moved to lift the body, but faltered halfway. His breath caught. Abigail didn't offer help. She let him face the weight of what he'd done. When they finally rolled Billy into the earth, the thud was heavier than flesh, like a stone dropping into memory. They buried the second one next Cole, the one with quiet eyes and a sharper knife. Abigail stared at him longer, then whispered, "He used to whistle when they left me alone. Every night, same tune, said it helped him sleep." Samuel swallowed hard. "Monsters sleep too." "No," she said, voice barely audible. "They don't." The final grave was wide enough for a man larger than either of them. The brute Samuel had killed with his bare hands. No prayer was spoken. No marker was laid. Samuel stood at the edge, shovel in hand, staring down at the distorted face he'd unmade. His mouth opened once, then closed again. "I didn't want to be this," he finally said. "You never had a choice," Abigail answered. "Not once you found me." He looked at her then. Really looked. For a long moment they just breathed the same air. "I buried men before," he said quietly. "War men, with names, with medals. But this feels like I buried something in myself too." Abigail nodded, eyes softening. "You did." By the time the sun began bleeding across the horizon, they were both sitting on the porch. The graves were invisible from this angle, but they could feel them like bruises under the skin of the land. Abigail cradled a chipped mug of coffee. Samuel nursed his silence. Finally, she spoke. "I used to think justice was a man in uniform, or a courtroom, something clean." She took a sip. "Now I know it's just 2 people with dirty hands, and the courage to finish what others start." He tilted his head. "You think this was justice?" "No," she said. "But it's the closest thing I've seen to it." The wind picked up then, soft and cold, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly sweet, honeysuckle maybe. For the first time in days, Samuel felt like he could inhale without choking on memory. Abigail stood stretching her sore limbs. "I'm going to wash. The blood's caked behind my knees." Samuel nodded. She paused before stepping inside. Her voice dropped nearly a whisper. "You know what Wade said the last time I saw him?" Samuel looked up. His jaw tightened. "No," he said. "You'll die screaming, but no one's going to hear you. Pretty little liars never get to grow old." Her hands trembled just slightly, fingers brushing over her ribs. He smiled when he said it, like it was scripture. Samuel stood slowly, walked toward her. His steps were deliberate, but his voice was soft. "Well," he was wrong about the screaming. Her lips twitched, barely a smile, but it was there. "And about growing old," she added. "That's still to be seen." They stood close enough now to share warmth, not from fire, from presence. After a pause, Samuel said, "My mother had a hymn she sang while shelling peas. I don't remember the words, just the rhythm. It always made her hands gentler." Abigail looked at him, puzzled. "You're the rhythm now," he continued. "That steadies my hands." She blinked hard once. "That might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." I meant it to be." Later, as Samuel washed the shovels under a rusted pump, he glanced toward the graves. The wind had swept dust over the disturbed earth. No markers, no crosses, no names. And yet, nothing would ever forget. Inside the cabin, Abigail had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove, a blanket drawn up to her chin. Her hair, now washed and combed, framed her face in quiet waves. The old scars on her arms seemed faded in the firelight. Samuel stood at the doorway and watched her breathe. For a moment he considered reaching for his Bible, dust-covered and unopened on the shelf, but instead he whispered something into the quiet, "Not forgiveness, Lord. Not yet. Just let her rest." And he turned back toward the stove, adding another log. The crackle was soft, warm, alive. The night held no sermons, but it held peace, and for now, that was enough. The cabin had grown quiet in a different way. Not the hollow silence of grief, nor the suffocating stillness that had once pressed between them like a closed door. This silence was gentler, like morning snow over a battlefield, long after the guns had fallen quiet. It didn't demand anything. It simply stayed. Outside, the wind stirred through dry pine needles. Inside, the fire snapped in the hearth, soft and rhythmic, echoing the slow, steady return of life. Abigail Monroe sat at the small wooden table, her fingers curled loosely around a tin mug of broth. The steam warmed her cheeks, but it was Samuel Everett's presence across the room, quiet, steady, not asking for anything, that warmed the deeper ache she still hadn't found the words for. He was sanding a chair leg near the window, sleeves rolled up sawdust clinging to his forearms. The chair wasn't broken. He just needed something to do with his hands. She understood that. "You don't preach anymore," she said. Finally, her voice scratchy but steady. Samuel looked up, met her gaze. Not out loud. Abigail gave the hint of a smile. "Do you miss it?" He thought for a long moment, running a hand through his beard. "I miss the parts that were true. I don't miss pretending the rest was." The fire cracked again. Something inside her, something raw and long buried, softened at his honesty. She traced the rim of her mug. "The last time someone sat that quiet with me, I was 10 years old. My mama had just died. My daddy didn't say a word, just handed me a pair of scissors and told me to cut her hair before the coffin came." Samuel set the sandpaper down. "I don't remember her face," Abigail whispered, "but I remember the weight of that braid in my lap, heavy as grief, heavy as everything I didn't know how to carry." Her voice trembled on the edge of a memory that had waited decades to be spoken. "She deserved more than silence," Samuel said quietly. "So did I," she replied, and the truth of it hung in the air between them. Each day, Abigail walked a little farther from the bed. At first, it was just to the fire, then the table. Now, out onto the porch, where the breeze smelled of wood smoke and something faintly alive, sap maybe, or the ghost of rain that hadn't fallen yet. She wore Samuel's old coat sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hands still trembled, but she refused to let them stop her. Not anymore. Samuel watched from the doorframe, not hovering, just there. "Did you sharpen the rifle?" she asked without turning. "It's not a blade," he said, amused. "Well," she murmured, "I'm planning to cut something down with it." Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. He couldn't help but admire it. She turned to face him, serious now. "Teach me." He nodded once. "Tomorrow, when the light's better." That night, Abigail woke with a cry caught in her throat. Not a scream, just a sound, sharp, involuntary. The kind a hurt child makes when they've learned it doesn't matter. Samuel was already by her side. He didn't touch her. He never did, unless she reached first. But his presence was there, a weight she could lean into if she chose. Reese used to say I was lucky, she whispered. Said I was too pretty to be buried in a hole somewhere like other girls who talked too much. Samuel's jaw tightened. They carved that into me to make me remember, she continued, voice shaking. Not just the words. The message. Your body is ours. Your silence is required. Her fingers clawed the blanket. But I'm still talking, aren't I? Samuel sat down beside her, hands resting on his knees. Yes, he said, and every word you speak is a crack in their hold. Keep talking. She looked at him, eyes wet and fierce. Then you keep listening. I'm not going anywhere. Morning came, cold with frost on the edges of the windows. The air inside the cabin smelled of stew iron and lavender, the last a surprise until Samuel explained he'd found wild sprigs behind the shed. I thought you might want something that didn't smell like blood and gunpowder, he said, almost sheepishly. Abigail pressed the small bundle of lavender to her chest, like a memory she wasn't ready to release. Later that day, they stood in a clearing behind the cabin. The trees kept the wind down and the sun filtered through in soft rays. Samuel handed her the rifle. It was heavy in her arms. Breathe, he said. Not like you're about to fight, like you're about to survive. She inhaled. Again. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her shoulder. She missed the first 3 shots, cursed under her breath, and missed the 4th. But on the 5th, the tin can spun off the log and landed with a satisfying thud. She exhaled like she'd just released 10 years of fear. Samuel nodded. That's yours now. The sound of not being afraid. That evening, as she stirred a pot of beans, Abigail looked over her shoulder. You ever wonder, she said softly, what it means to be forgiven? Samuel looked up from cleaning his boots. All the time. I used to think it meant forgetting, she said, letting it all go. But now I think it means carrying it better. She turned back to the pot. My scars don't disappear, but maybe they stop bleeding. He crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching, just standing there. I don't think God lives in buildings anymore, he said, but I think he might live in a woman who still cooks beans. After all she's survived. That made her laugh. It caught in her throat like a child's giggle. As night fell, Abigail stepped onto the porch. The stars came out like tiny promises. She wrapped herself in Samuel's coat again. He joined her, 2 mugs in hand, one for her, one for him. No words, just the scent of cedar smoke and cinnamon tea. After a long while, she said, Do you think they'll come again? Yes, he replied. Are we ready? No, he said, then paused. But we will be. She nodded slowly, then whispered, Thank you. For what? For staying, she said. For not needing to save me. Just stay. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She reached for his hand. For the first time, her grip was steady. The news came with the morning bread. An old man on a mule brought it, face hidden beneath a hat, too large for his head, the brim stained with sweat and silence. He didn't knock, just left a folded note and a half loaf wrapped in wax paper on the fence post, then turned around without a word. The mule kicked dust into the air like it was swatting at memories. Abigail Monroe stood on the porch, arms crossed tight across her chest. She'd already known. The sky had felt strange when she woke off balance, like it too was holding its breath. Samuel Everett unfolded the note slowly, as if the truth inside might burn. They found a body in the river, he read aloud. By the crossing near Elk Hollow. Whitmore. They're calling it suicide. Abigail didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her fingers clenched until the skin around her knuckles went white. He didn't jump, she said finally, her voice low, firm. He was pushed. And they're pushing us next. The coffee on the table had gone cold, forgotten in the quiet storm that now sat between them. They made their way to the crossing by late afternoon, moving like shadows down trails no longer marked on any map. The river was slow that day, thick and quiet, like it had secrets it didn't want stirred. At the edge, near a bend, where cottonwoods leaned in, as if to whisper, someone had placed a crude wooden cross. Samuel stood in silence. He remembered Mr. Whitmore as a man of dusty boots and gentle hands. He remembered the way he'd once folded a small paper bird for a child crying at church, how he'd slipped a sack of flour onto a widow's porch when no one was watching. And now this. "He raised me," Abigail said. Her voice barely carried. "Not with blood, but with kindness. He taught me how to plant carrots by the moon, and how to spot liars by their eyebrows. He used to hum when he patched my boots, said the stitches held better that way." Samuel turned to her, startled by the softness in her voice. But her eyes, they were stone. "They dumped him like trash," she said. "And no one will ask why. They didn't stay long." The sheriff had posted 2 men on horseback at the crossing, too far to hear, but close enough to remember faces. Samuel caught a glimpse of one of them, Bartley, a boy who used to stutter his way through scripture, and now twirled a rifle like it was a dance partner. On the ride back, Abigail said nothing. Her hands gripped the saddle horn like it was the only thing keeping her tethered. Dust clung to her lashes. The wind didn't speak. Finally, as they reached the ridge overlooking the cabin, she stopped her horse and turned to Samuel. Her voice was soft, brittle, like dry leaves. "If they're rewriting the story of his death, they'll rewrite mine too." He didn't answer. She looked at him. Then not the way a woman looks at a man, but the way someone drowning looks at a distant shore. "When they find us, Samuel, they won't ask who we are. They'll decide." That night, thunder rumbled low over the hills, distant but promising. Rain didn't fall, but the earth seemed to listen anyway. Abigail sat near the hearth, her knees drawn to her chest, her dress damp with creek water. Her hair, still wet, hung loose down her back. She held something in her lap, an old faded bandana she'd pulled from the saddlebag Mr. Whitmore had once given her. "He wasn't perfect," she said suddenly. "He drank too much when it rained for days, cursed at rabbits that ate his lettuce. But he never raised his hand to me, not once. And when I told him what I'd seen at the bank, what Wade Blackwell and his men were doing, he didn't tell me to be quiet. He told me to write it down. So I did." She reached into the folds of her skirt and pulled out a sheet of paper, yellowed and creased. "It's not much, but it's names, signatures, deeds, a ledger that shouldn't exist." Samuel took the paper, his hands shaking slightly. The ink had bled in places, but the names were still legible. Wade Blackwell, Cole Ramsey, Sheriff Danton. Payments dates, land sales marked with numbers that didn't match the town's official records. "It's proof," he murmured. Abigail's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's a death sentence." Later, as the fire dimmed and shadows stretched across the cabin walls like weary ghosts, Samuel stood at the window watching the night. He'd once believed in a God who kept tally of good deeds, who blessed the righteous and punished the wicked. But the river didn't carry justice, it carried bodies, and sometimes the only hand reaching down to pull you out was your own. Behind him, Abigail stirred. "I dreamt of him," she said softly. "He was standing on the porch wearing that old flannel shirt with the missing button. He didn't speak, just looked at me like he always did, like I mattered." She paused. "That's the part that hurts the most. He's gone. And the only people who remember who he really was are being hunted." Samuel turned toward her. His voice, when it came, was low and raw. "Then we won't be quiet. Not anymore." Abigail looked up. "Even if no one listens." He crossed the room slowly and sat beside her. "Especially then." At dawn they buried the paper beneath a loose board in the floor. It wouldn't stop bullets, but it would stop lies if the day ever came someone dared to look. They didn't speak much after that, not until Samuel handed her a new saddlebag and said, "You're riding with me tomorrow. We're going to Elk Hollow. If Whitmore's death can be rewritten, so can his legacy." Abigail didn't smile, but something flickered behind her eyes like a lantern lit in a far-off room. She took the bag. "All right then," she said. "Let's make 'em remember." And outside, somewhere beyond the hills, the river kept on moving, slow, steady, and unbothered. But the world had changed. Just a little. Just enough. Because two people scarred and quiet had chosen to remember what others tried to forget. And sometimes, that's where justice begins. The town of Wilton lay still beneath the weight of a low gray sky, its wooden bones creaking beneath the wind, like a body remembering pain. The streets, once dusty and humming with merchants and murmurs, now seemed to listen, as if the town knew something was coming, or perhaps something long buried was stirring again. Samuel Everett led Abigail Monroe up the back steps of the sheriff's office, his hand firm on her elbow. She didn't need his guidance. Her steps were steady now, but his touch wasn't about strength. It was about knowing she wasn't walking into this alone. The air inside the small wooden building was warm with stale tobacco and something sour, maybe disappointment left too long in the sun. Behind the desk, Sheriff Hal McCrae looked up from a stained mug of coffee, his boots crossed on the desk, his face a map of years and compromises. "Samuel," he said flatly, "heard you died." Samuel smiled, but there was no mirth in it. Almost. The sheriff's eyes slid to Abigail. A flicker passed through his features, recognition, maybe even guilt, but it vanished like breath on a mirror. "You shouldn't be here," McCrae said, voice low. Abigail took a step forward. "Neither should a good man stand silent while devils own the land." She said it not with anger, but with a quiet that pressed against the walls. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her voice didn't crack. McCrae set the mug down with a dull clink. "I thought you were gone," he muttered. "Folks said you ran off into the brush like a wild dog. I was left to die like one." She replied. Samuel pulled a worn envelope from inside his coat. She didn't. And she brought this. Inside was the deed Whitmore's land signed and witnessed, alongside documents showing fraudulent transfers, a forged will, Blackwell's signature in a hand too perfect to be his. McCrae didn't reach for it. He looked at the paper like it might catch flame. "You think that changes anything," he said softly. "Wade Blackwell owns this town. The judge, the bank hell, even the preacher after you took off." Samuel took a step closer. "I didn't bring you papers, Hal. I brought you a choice." The silence stretched long, a rope pulled between them. "I've known you a long time," Samuel added. "You used to cry at funerals. You used to pray with both hands, not just one on your holster." "What happened?" McCrae's jaw worked. "I got tired of burying people who told the truth." He turned toward Abigail. "I did nothing to help you, and I'll carry that. But you bringing this to me. What do you want, girl? A trial?" "Justice." Her eyes met his. They were not soft. "I want it written down. That I said his name. That someone heard it. That I didn't disappear without a sound." That's when the sheriff's hand moved not to the gun on his hip, but to a locked drawer in the desk. He pulled out a dusty book, the Old Town Ledger. He hadn't opened it in years. He set it down and opened to a blank page. "Speak slow. Wade Blackwell," she said. "He killed Mr. Whitmore. Had Clyde and Cole beat it into me until I forgot how to breathe. He forged deeds, burned records, and carved lies into my skin." McCrae's hand trembled as he wrote. "She speaks truth," Samuel said, "and I will testify under oath to every word of it." McCrae stopped. He looked at them, at Samuel, once his oldest friend, and at the woman whose bruises had faded but not vanished. "You understand," the sheriff said quietly, "that I can't protect you. Once this is written, there's no hiding again." "I'm not hiding," Abigail replied. "I already lived through the worst night of my life. What comes next is just light or shadow." And that was when the door creaked open. A gust of cold air followed Martin Danner Blackwell's courier and enforcer, dressed in black wool and arrogance. He tipped his hat. "Heard there was a ghost in town. Guess I'm not surprised you'd come running to Hal." Martin McCrae set his voice like an old fence post, weathered split, but still standing. "You've got no badge. I've got Wade's name." Martin smiled. "That's worth more." Abigail didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stepped between Martin and the desk, her shoulders squared. "I'm done being afraid," she whispered. Martin chuckled. "You think this changes anything? You think anyone's gonna listen to a whore left in the hay?" Samuel moved then, not fast, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd buried too many regrets. He stood beside Abigail. "Say it again," he said, "but look her in the eyes when you do." Martin's grin faltered. "Didn't think so," Samuel said. "She's not the one who will be remembered with blood on his boots." McCrae stood too, ledger still open. "You're not welcome here, Martin," he said. "You planning to stop me?" "I just wrote a sworn statement," McCrae said. "By a survivor, a preacher, and now a sheriff. If I'm next, someone'll know why." There was a shift in the room then. Martin didn't smile anymore. He looked around like the walls were listening, then turned and left his boots heavy on the planks. The door slammed behind him. For a long time no one spoke. Then McCrae sat down again, his fingers tracing the names on the page. "I don't know if this saves anyone," he said quietly, "but I've seen too many graves dug for silence." Abigail nodded. "So have I." Outside, the sky had started to break apart, the clouds thinning, letting slices of blue slip through. Samuel looked to the sheriff, voice thick. "You don't have to save everyone, Hal. Just stop helping the ones who bury them." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the weight of his own conscience finally settling in his bones. "You two better go," he said. "This town's about to feel colder than that wind." They left without a word, the door clicking shut behind them. But as they stepped out onto the porch, Samuel paused. He looked up at the church steeple in the distance, then down at the woman beside him, scarred strong and still standing. He didn't need to preach anymore, not when the truth was walking beside him, step for step. Abigail spoke first, quiet as dawn. "He remembered my name." Samuel glanced at her. "The sheriff," she said. "He remembered my name. After all this time." Samuel smiled. "Then today," he whispered, "is the first day you come back to the world." They walked on toward the edge of town, leaving footprints behind them like a slow, soft declaration. We were here. We lived. And we didn't stay silent. The wind off the bluff that night had a bitter edge. Not cold exactly, just old. Like it had passed through too many broken fences, too many graves, too many mouths that no longer had a name to call out. Samuel Everett crouched low among the shadows behind the cottonwood trees, watching the last flicker of lantern light vanish through the narrow window of Wade Blackwell's bank. He'd been here before, countless times, as a preacher, as a boy, as a man clinging to rules that had long since failed him. But tonight, he came with no Bible, just a torn piece of truth and a fire in his chest that wouldn't wait any longer. Beside him, Abigail Monroe knelt silent and sharp-eyed, her breath steady, despite the thin line of blood drying along her jaw. Her coat was too large, his too small. Nothing they wore quite fit anymore, not clothes, not roles, not the world. In her hands, she clutched the rolled deeds from Mr. Whitmore's land, the real ones stained with old ink and fresher blood. Samuel leaned in close. Once we take this public, there's no walking it back. She didn't answer at first, just stared at the building like it might speak the name of every man it had buried in silence. Then softly, like she was telling it to the walls, and not to him, she said, "He told me my voice was too small to be heard, but even whispers travel in firelight." He nodded. No sermon could have said it better. They moved fast after that, cutting across the alley, slipping through the back cellar door Samuel remembered from his youth. The hinges still groaned like an old woman trying to stand. Inside, it smelled of must and lies and scorched ink. They didn't need to be quiet for long. Wade Blackwell was waiting in his office, whiskey in hand backlit by the orange glow of the oil lamp. His boots were up on the desk, and his eyes gleamed like river stones pretty until you picked them up and felt how cold they really were. "Well, if it ain't the prodigal preacher and the whore he dragged out of the dust," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Y'all come to confess or burn something down." Samuel stepped forward, rifle lowered, but ready. "We came to end it." Wade leaned forward slowly, his glass swirling in one hand. "End what, Reverend? The lies you've told yourself, or the fantasy that you can clean blood with more blood?" Abigail's voice, quiet and steady, cut across the room like a knife. "You branded me like cattle, watched while they held me down, and then you sent men to make sure I never spoke again." He turned toward her, no apology in his face. "I don't deny it. You knew too much. And in this world, truth don't walk free. It rides with a noose round its neck." Abigail took a step closer, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "You killed Mr. Whitmore, forged his signature, stole his land. And when I saw what you did, you tried to make me disappear." Wade laughed once. "And what? Now you think telling it makes it matter. Darling, out here, justice is whatever the man with the louder voice says it is." Samuel raised the rifle, not trembling, not shaking, just still. "Then we'll make sure the silence that follows your voice is louder." But Wade didn't flinch. He stood slowly, tossing the glass into the fire behind him. The flames cracked louder. "You won't shoot me," he said, voice low, oily. "You don't kill in cold blood. You hold hands. You forgive." Samuel said nothing, but his silence was no longer holy. It was the silence of weight of choice. It was Abigail who moved first. She flung the deeds onto the desk. "We mailed a copy to the federal judge in Austin this morning." Wade's face dropped. "You can't stop it now," she said, stepping closer. "But you can burn with it." The fire started small, an old curtain catching behind Wade when the lamp was knocked from its place in the scuffle. By the time they wrestled the door open, half the bank was lit like a funeral pyre. Wade stumbled, cursing into the smoke, reaching for the deeds as flames licked at the edges. Abigail grabbed Samuel's arm. "Let it go." But Samuel stepped forward. "He dies in fire or in silence. Either way, he dies." And then from the corner of the burning room, Wade Blackwell turned and looked directly at them. "No one will remember you," he spat. "You'll fade like dust, same as the rest." Samuel's voice didn't rise. It just landed. "She will remember. And that's enough." The beam cracked behind Wade with a groan, like judgment. And just like that, the ceiling came down. With it, the man, the lies, the shame, the years. They watched the bank burn from the hill above, sitting in the hush of midnight pine. Abigail had her arms wrapped around her knees. Samuel had nothing left in his hands, not even the rifle. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Abigail said, "He made me believe I was small. Like my story didn't matter. like I was just survivable. Samuel looked at her. The fire cast long shadows down her cheekbones, but her eyes had never looked brighter. "You're not just what survived," he said. "You're what stayed." She turned to him, startled. "I've preached on a lot of mountains," he said, "but I never really listened to the wind until tonight." A tear slipped down her cheek, quick and surprised. She didn't wipe it away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small singed piece of cloth, Mr. Whitmore's handkerchief. He'd found it years ago after visiting the ranch before any of this began, held onto it without knowing why. He handed it to her. "His truth is yours now." She took it gently, like something sacred, and then in the hush that followed, she said, "Do you think a person can start over without going back?" Samuel nodded, his voice barely above the breeze. "No one starts over, but we walk forward. That's how healing happens, not from forgetting, but from refusing to be owned by remembering." The fire had nearly died down now, just glowing embers and the quiet hush of earth exhaling. In that silence, they sat, no longer preacher and victim, no longer ghosts, just two people who had chosen against every reason to stay awake inside the fire. And somehow, that was enough. The wind rose early that morning, stirring the ash-gray soil long before the sun touched it. It wasn't the sharp kind of wind that howls through canyon walls or slams shutters against lonely cabins. No, it was soft, persistent, like fingers brushing against old scars just to see if they still remembered pain. Samuel Everett stood at the edge of what used to be his land, one boot sunk into the dirt where they'd buried 3 men, the other planted firmly on the narrow path that led nowhere and everywhere. The preacher's coat was gone. So was the collar. All that remained was a man in plain clothes with knuckles still rough and sole worn thin as barnwood. Beside him, Abigail Monroe tightened the strap on her canvas bag. Her body still bore the echoes of what had been done to her, faint lines like faded script trailing across her skin. But her spine was straight, her hands steady. She didn't look back. Neither of them did. The cabin door clicked shut behind them, soft, final. The graves lay undisturbed, 3 mounds of earth beneath the trees. The church spire in the distance, once a beacon, now just a relic, like bones half buried in prairie grass. They walked without speaking, the sound of boots on gravel their only language. But it wasn't silence, not anymore. After nearly a mile, Samuel spoke. His voice didn't try to rise above the wind. It met it, quiet and worn. "Do you believe in redemption?" "Abigail." She paused mid-step, then turned her face to him. Her eyes weren't what they used to be, wide with fear or hollow from pain. They were watchful now, sharpened by survival. "I believe in earning it," she said, "even if nobody ever hands it to you." Samuel nodded. The kind of nod that came from the ribs, not the neck. A man who'd carried too much and finally learned that some things aren't meant to be carried alone. They didn't talk about Wade Blackwell. There was no need. The way he died, gasping in the dirt, his fingers scrabbling at the blood soaking his vest, had said everything. "You think killing him made us like him?" Samuel asked, more to the horizon than to her. Abigail exhaled through her nose, the kind of breath that held years behind it. "No. He carved his sins into my skin, Samuel. I just gave them back." She didn't flinch when she said it, but Samuel's jaw tightened. "He told me," Samuel murmured, "right before I pulled the trigger. This town belongs to men like me. Folks need fear more than they need truth." Abigail stopped. The sun was climbing behind her, now warming the nape of her neck. She looked at him, not with comfort, but with something deeper, a kind of seeing. He was wrong. 3 words, soft, unblinking. But they cracked something open in him that had been sealed since the day he first held a Bible. By noon, they reached the river. Samuel's hands cupped cold water to her mouth, first, then to his own. They sat on the bank, chewing hardtack and dried beef, sharing silence like a meal. Above them, a hawk circled. Below, their reflections shimmered blurred, but side by side. Samuel reached into his bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He didn't speak as he handed it to her. Inside was a pocket-sized Bible, the same one he used to carry to funerals, births, marriages. There were bloodstains on the cover, some dried, some not. "I don't carry it for preaching anymore," he said. Abigail looked at the cover, then back to him. Then why his voice dropped lower. To remember the weight of words, before they failed. She nodded slowly, closing the cloth again. She didn't hand it back. By sundown, they reached the old wagon trail. A faded sign half buried in brush read, "Welcome to Ashford Crossing." The paint had peeled away the wood eaten by time and neglect. It wasn't home, but it was far enough from the blood and the lies. Abigail looked over her shoulder once, not at the past, but at the space it used to fill. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. Some people weep. Some people just breathe deeper. Samuel's voice, a low rasp, now carried toward her. "We could stop here, just for the night, and then we keep walking, until something feels honest." A beat passed. Then she nodded. They found shelter in a dilapidated way station. Broken chairs, a stone hearth, the kind of place that once welcomed strangers with warm stew and a clean blanket. Samuel made a fire. Abigail unrolled the blanket. It was domestic in the quietest, strangest way. As night fell, he sat on the floor across from her, the flames drawing shadows across his face. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I'd turned around and left you there?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, looking into the fire, she said, "You'd still be preaching to people who never really listened, and I'd be bones in a field no one remembered." The truth settled between them like another log on the fire. Heavy, honest. Samuel's fingers brushed his jaw where the last fight had left a small scar. "You changed me, Abigail." She shook her head gently. "No, I just held up a mirror." At dawn, birds stirred in the broken rafters. Light came like a benediction, slow, golden, undeserved. Samuel stood by the door, watching the world soften under morning. Abigail stepped beside him, holding the cloth-wrapped Bible. She placed it in his hands and looked him square in the eye. "Don't carry it for them," she said. "Carry it for you, for what you've seen, for what you chose." He didn't reply, just gripped it tight. They stepped outside together. The world was wide again. Behind them, the cabin fell quiet. Ahead, the trail split 3 ways, each leading somewhere they hadn't been. They didn't need to choose. Not yet. They walked, not fast, not like fugitives, but like people who'd paid a price and were finally free to live with what they had left. A hawk cried overhead, and the wind followed them not as warning, but as witness.